everyone, Michael from Teams by Design. We've just recently launched our after-hour phone service. What that means for you is we can now answer your phone calls from 5 p.m. Monday through Friday and all day Saturday and Sunday. We can help you with inquiries such as property inquiry, leasing inquiry, maintenance support, and new business inquiries. So please make sure you head to teamsbydesign.com, leave your information, we'll arrange a Zoom and catch up and show you how we can help you through this.
Hi everyone, it is Darren Hunter here with a PM Power podcast show. Of course, you can watch this podcast show or you can subscribe to our audio platforms, Spotify, Podbean, and iTunes podcast. And today we have Villi Tossi, who is from Watson Real Estate, based in Palmerston North on the North Island of New Zealand. Welcome, Villi. Thank you so much for your time.
Cheers, mate. Good to be here.
Cool. Now, we are going to be hammering out dealing with our late serial offenders. Now, Villi, we were doing zero tolerance rent control training with you and your team. You got a big team there in Palmerston North. Do you remember what was your arrears percentage when we calculated it? What was it?
Yeah, I think when we put some numbers to you, Darren, I think you worked it out at 0.91%.
Or 0.91, or is it even 0.5% of tenants behind in the rent? I couldn't believe we did a whole hour of zero tolerance rent control training. Then we actually looked at your rent control results, and there was some of the smallest, best, amazing zero tolerance rent control results I've ever seen. And I just thought, Villi, why didn't we just do an hour of training? I just couldn't believe it. But look, let's move on. Before we get on, people are looking at that picture behind you. Villi, what is that picture? Tell us, because you got Mickey Mouse and it looks like some artwork there. Tell us about that picture.
It's a pretty cool painting, actually. It's a New Zealand artist called Dick Frizzle, who there'll be probably New Zealanders out there that are familiar with the Mickey to Tiki artwork that he's created. So it's sort of like a timeline starting with Mickey Mouse and then ending up, sort of at the end there being the Māori tiki symbol. So pretty cool piece of artwork that we have up on the wall here.
Cool. And of course, for the people out there, the Māori are the native people to New Zealand. No, it's really, really good to see that culture there on the wall. Let's move on. Okay, so let's talk about serial late rent offenders. And we're going to talk about getting the mindset right first, Villi, and then we're going to move into talking about strategy. And I think what's really important, particularly for our Americans listening, one of the big differences you need to understand between Australia and, if we can say, New Zealand and Australia together, our culture in Australia and New Zealand, particularly in Australia, is very protective of the tenant. And I make a joke saying that, in Australia, the koala is protected, the platypus is protected, the kookaburra is protected, and so is the tenant. The tenant is also listed as a protected species, and New Zealand over the years follows very closely to what Australia does with their protection laws. And of course, we are not allowed to charge any late rent fees whatsoever. In fact, we cannot charge any tenant fees at all. Only owners can be charged anything. So with that in mind, and tenants get behind in the rent, we can't just impose on them some big fee as a de-incentive. We can't use any of that. So we have to get really, really good at chasing what we call our serial late rent offenders. So let's just get into and identify this, because through the COVID period that at the moment we're still in, there has been some different types of people getting behind in the rent. So the people that were genuinely affected by COVID. Now, Villi, do you remember how many tenants in your company their income was genuinely affected by COVID? How many?
Yeah, we didn't have many, but we probably had maybe a dozen over the entire sort of lockdown period here in New Zealand in our sort of portfolio, and that's our entire portfolio. And they were genuine, lost their job, huge impact to their income, and were able to provide us with proof that they were seriously affected, which was going to have a pretty massive effect to being able to pay rent. yeah, obviously you had quite a few people trying to use and abuse the system, you know, where they'd say they were effective, but technically they weren't. So we were able to identify that pretty quickly, and the use of you know, some documentation that we were able to use here in New Zealand to be able to get tenants to prove that they actually were effective was valuable.
Yeah.
So that really did help us through that period as well.
I think it's fair to say, though, we're not talking about them today, because tenants that are genuinely behind, please understand, everybody, what we're talking about today and the strategies we're going to talk about are not for them, because the serial late rent offender is a different species altogether. So that's who we go to war with. We've got to be very, very careful. We're not here to penalize good tenants that fall on hard times. Okay, so if we do have that, we've got to treat them with respect. We've got to treat their case on merit, work with them as best we can, of course, keeping the owner's interests in mind as well, because that is who we're contracted to. So let's talk about the serial late rent offender. Now, I just want to outline, it is my belief that tenants who are regularly behind in rent, and people that, you know, play the system, all of that, is probably one of the worst evils that can happen in property management. Because over my years, I've realized that 80% of the problems that are caused in our businesses, directly and indirectly, is because of someone that has gotten behind in the rent or something like that. It can skew into all sorts of consequences if we don't keep on top of it. Now, Villi, I remember with the training that we did with you guys, it's really important that we've got to establish why we've got to have a zero tolerance attitude in the mindset first, because an eviction is one of the worst things that can happen. It is the worst thing. And I say it's like a packet of cigarettes, and an eviction for a property manager can take years of our life, because there's so many victims. When a person gets evicted, we've got so many victims. We've got the owner who's a victim, because he now has to go and scramble and find income elsewhere to pay his mortgage and all of those problems. We've got the property manager who's a victim, because there is, and of course the company's going to become a victim because they're going to miss out on that particular income. The property manager themselves has become a big victim because of the amount of time and the stress and the problems that are going to be created for them to try and manage the situation as best they can through an eviction. But not only that, the victims don't stop. We've got the tenants' children that are the innocent victims in this. And I think the worst thing a property manager can do is look into the eyes of a tenant's child who's been removed from their home. It's a sad situation. And then the tenant themselves are victims of themselves in a lot of cases, because they've fooled themselves into thinking it's okay to spend their money on other things, thinking they can catch up on their rent, but they've fooled themselves. So we've got victims all around. And one of the things I think, Villi, we did a time and motion study with the time it takes to initially get the paperwork going with a breach, getting the rent arrears or the late rent process started. We're getting all the documents served on tenants, getting it served at tribunal or court, whatever, going to and from the property to make sure if the tenant's there or not, talking to the owner, then going through the court process, then the back and forwards to the property, doing a final inspection or overseeing the eviction. Then we've got to deal with tradespeople in America, they call them vendors. And all this time, if you add it all up and you get serious about your travel time and everything, it's anywhere between 18 to 30 hours of time. And so with all of this stuff in mind, this is what is waiting for us if we are tolerant. Because if we are not, if we don't have zero tolerance, then the tenant could well go beyond what I call their point of no return, which is the point where they've realized, hey, I can't catch up now. They're headed for eviction, and it all just goes downhill from here. So we all have to agree an eviction is one of the worst things that can happen. And
I think a property manager, it's the last thing that a property manager wants to do, right? Is to evict someone out. And I think that property manager gets a bad name because that's all they really are known for, is evicting people, doing inspections, collecting rent, and evicting tenants. And for me, that's completely untrue. A property manager will do everything they possibly can in order to get that tenant back on track, to get their rents paid on time, to avoid, evicting a family, or that has effect on the children, or the owner, or the property manager themselves. Because, like you say, Darren, it's a huge investment in not only time, but certainly money as well. So I think to break it down, like you've said, is a really good way to start for property managers and property management companies, is actually break it down into chunks of time. How much time does it actually take for me to move or to evict a tenant out of that property? Is there a solution here to be able to fix, so that I don't have to go through those steps, which is going to invest, more time for me? It's going to create more stress. I'm going to be more overwhelmed, but also the cost and money that it's associated to not only the owner, but the company itself.
Now, Villi, an owner, if they've got an eviction, they not only think they've got a bad tenant, but they also will want to blame the property manager as well. So it just gets all bad. And what I like to say as well, that when we have a tolerant attitude, then we are pro-eviction, because we're allowing the tenant to go past what I call that point of no return, where they fool themselves into thinking, well, I'll catch up next week, when they go, oh crap, I'm now too far behind. There's no way I can catch up. And we know now they're headed over the cliff of eviction. So a tolerant attitude is pro-eviction. However, a zero tolerant attitude is really pro-tenant, because it keeps the tenant in a property. And we have to do all we can to not have an eviction. And what I mean by that is that if that means that we upset the tenant, we offend the tenant, we put their nose out of joint, but at the end of the day, they're still in a home, their kids are still in a home, and we haven't had an eviction, everybody's a winner. Though the tenant may not like us, they're still in a better situation.
Yeah, definitely. And it's definitely like you said before, the property management and the company will be the first to be blamed around any issues, in particular when it comes to tenants not paying rent. At the end of the day, the owners just want someone living in their investment property that is going to look after it and going to pay their rent on time.
Yeah.
Now, as the property manager, it's your responsibility to ensure that you put someone into the property that meets those needs and those requirements. So if they don't, all of a sudden the owner starts to question, the process that you've followed in order to put that tenant in there, because, suddenly it starts to snowball. And like you say, it just, as one issue starts to accumulate, another one comes on. And so it does become a snowball effect if you don't address it, earlier on.
Yeah. Let's just talk about, I want to address what an actual serial late rent offender really is. Let's just get in deep here, because they are the stars, the rock stars, you could say sarcastically, on our late rent list. They're always there. They're every month, or if in America, in Australia, New Zealand, we work on weekly rents. So it's every week or every 2 weeks. They're regularly there. They take a lot of time to keep on top of. Now, Villi,
you would have had a few excuses over the years, Darren, with regards to these
we've heard all the
offenders,
excuses and the weird and wacky stuff that goes on. But I think what people need to realize is that getting the rent paid, what the rent is actually in competition with. So with a serial late rent offender, what we need to understand is that we are battling what I call the vices. And the vices is my term I use for an addiction that the tenant would likely have, where they prioritize their rent money. You see, with serial late rent offenders, they don't have a money problem. They get paid as regularly as what we do, whether it's through a job or through some government benefit or something like that. They get paid as regularly as what we do. So they don't actually have a money problem. And they don't have a memory problem. They didn't forget to pay. It's not like they woke up one day and go, wow, there's $1,000 in my account. I can't remember what that's for. They didn't wake up one day and forget that they've got to pay the rent. So we never really need to send them a reminder letter, and those stupid things that we do, they don't need reminding. In fact, if we remind them, they probably think we're nuts, because they don't have a memory problem. They didn't forget. They have a priority problem, and they believe that paying the rent isn't priority. but they have other priorities greater, which is alcohol or gambling or drugs or whatever. And in Australia and New Zealand, the Americans don't understand. We add cigarettes to that because cigarettes, particularly in Australia, are so heavily taxed. A packet of cigarettes is like 20, 30, 35 bucks or whatever. It's so extreme in cost. If a person has a serious smoking habit, it can really badly affect the rent as well. So with those vices involved, Villi, what I found is that the serial late rent offender, the person that's always behind, the person that always has an excuse, the person that we're always chasing, is invariably feeding their rent money into the vices.
Yeah, I'd totally agree. Rent, I guess, becomes less of a priority for people, and which is, for us as we make sure we clearly identify that it is a priority. Excuse me. And so therefore, it's a case of just making sure that you can identify that earlier on. With these serious, late offenders. But yeah, like you say, you can sort of pick up on cues. With gambling, with drugs, criminal activity, even smoking. If you're taking on a tenancy where they do highlight that they are smokers. Obviously, you can't discriminate against that, but you can instantly say that smoking is a pretty significant cost to that family or to that dynamic that may have some sort of consequence at some stage in the future on rent not being paid. So I guess as a project manager, you can start to get really smart around identifying late offenders and the reasons behind them, not paying their rent or not treating rent as a priority.
Absolutely. And I think moving on with this.
Hi everyone, Michael from Teams by Design. We've just recently launched our after-hour phone service. What that means for you is we can now answer your phone calls from 5 p.m. Monday through Friday and all day Saturday and Sunday. We can help you with inquiries such as property inquiry, leasing inquiry, maintenance support, and new business inquiries. So please make sure you head to teamsbydesign.com, leave your information, we'll arrange a Zoom and catch up and show you how we can help you through this.
It's important to understand that it takes little effort to jump on the problem early. So I use this analogy when I'm teaching this, is that either we become very good at putting big boots on and stamping out a smoldering cigarette butt as an analogy, as opposed to fighting fires. And so I use this analogy all the time, and this is where we're dealing with serial late offenders. And let's just say, as property managers, we are highway patrol officers, and we're sitting on our big Harley, highway patrol bike. We're sitting on the side of the highway, and these cars are just going by us. But then suddenly one throws a cigarette from the window, and as a patrol officer, we watch that cigarette hit the road. But we're too busy. We're talking on our CB radio. We're doing this. We're on our phone looking at Facebook, whatever. But we actually see the cigarette hit the road, roll to the side, and it actually bumps up against some paper or some trash or something like that and starts to smolder. But we're still busy on our bike. And watching this, and suddenly that little bit of smoke pops, it got a bit of a flame, then appears, and the flame grows bigger, and now the actual flame is catching on to the bushes at the side of the road, and now before you know it, the flames have jumped from the bushes to the trees and now to the house that's near the roadside. And now this is where the officer gets off their bike and now tries to put out a big fire when they should have got off their bike as soon as that cigarette hits the road and put their boot down and stamp it out immediately. It takes far less effort to get on top of it really, really early than fighting a bushfire later on and all the damage and consequences that can bring. And with us, we've got to be willing to jump on people really, really quickly, really, really early, because it's that early situation. I say, if you go to war on the tenant, the serial late rent offender, within that first 7 days, you can stop the fire. But if you let it go beyond that, that's where we move into damage and possible the situation getting out of control. So this is what zero tolerance is all about, is having no tolerance whatsoever to allow a tenant to get behind at all. So let's just move on, Villi, out of establishing the mindset of why we've got to have a zero tolerant attitude because all the consequences are not worth it. Let's talk about process. And you mentioned before, it all starts at tenant selection.
Yeah. I think when you break down rent arrears or serious late offenders in a nutshell, you've got to take it right back to the beginning. I think some companies or some property managers will work reactively around tenants falling behind in rent. And so what I've identified with our team is not let it get to the point where halfway through a tenancy, you didn't actually inform the tenant through, the time you selected them, through the tenant induction, through to when they actually started to fall behind in rent. What would occur if they did fall behind in rent? And so we've identified that right from the start. So it's effectively right from when you show a tenant through a property, getting a feeling, getting an understanding of that tenant, and feeling comfortable that they would, be suited to that property, but also that they wouldn't put you in a position where it is going to take, or like we talked about earlier, it is going to take up a lot of your time and investment, later on down the track. Now, once you get to the point where you're sitting in front of a tenant, for me, that's where your zero tolerance rent arrears process starts. And it needs to start right from there. There needs to be a line drawn in the sand, and you need to make it very clear with a tenant around what your expectations are of them with regards to rent payments and any late rent payments, and what are the consequences of that. Because effectively, if a tenant doesn't know what the consequences are, they're just going to take you for a ride, and they'll continue to do it to the point where you get fed up and you get stressed and overwhelmed because they are just using and abusing the system. But effectively, I guess if you look at it, it's probably yourself to blame because you actually didn't sit down with the tenants and go through what the consequences would be. If you have strict consequences and they understand that right from the get-go, they wouldn't push the boundary. They wouldn't take you for a ride because they know that you're going to be on them in a flash. And so our team are very quick to identify when tenants fall behind, but they also action and back it up with what they've talked to the tenant about right from that tenant induction. And that simply goes back to, we get out our rent arrears process and we go through that rent arrears process with our tenant and we say, look, this is what's going to happen on day one. This is what's going to happen on day two. If you don't have it rectified by day three, then we're filing to tenancy tribunal on day four. So it's firm, but it's fair, and it makes it very clear. It sets clear expectations right from the get-go on that tenant and what to expect if they do fall behind in those situations. And I think most tenants, I guess, appreciate that honesty in terms of what you're going to do and how it will happen. Because when a tenant falls behind a rent and you haven't had that conversation, it almost comes as a surprise. So therefore, it's a negative. And what we talked about earlier is building a rapport with your tenant. You don't want to create a friction or a fraction between you and the tenant, because then it's very hard to mend and move forward in a positive fashion. So if you can you can be firm, draw a line in the sand, but explain it in a way that is relatable to your tenant, then it makes it a lot easier moving forward. We talk about it in our office, building goodwill, and it's an owner thing, and that's for a separate conversation. But you want to build goodwill with your tenants, and the goodwill that we outline to our tenants is just that rapport, that relationship that you've got with them. And if you can set that and build that relationship right from the start, then when something happens during that tenancy, the tenants feel like they've let you down, and so they want to do everything they can to make it right. Okay. So that's really important aspect, is to get it right from the get-go. Tenant induction is number one thing.
Yep, I agree. Tenant induction, but even back with tenant selection, we've got to be willing to keep a property vacant until we get the right person along. It's all about getting the best tenant, not the first tenant. So, tenant selection is so important. We cannot take risks because a bad tenant can only be a bad tenant. Doesn't matter what they say to you. Doesn't matter anything like that. Doesn't matter what they promise you. A bad tenant can only be who they are. An average tenant can only be who they are. And a good tenant can only be good. And that's subject to a change in their circumstances too. I thought I'd just add that. But what's important too, with the induction, as you said, clearly outlining what's the expectation, but also absolutely painting a clear picture of what the consequences look like should they choose to not pay the rent, and what action will be taken against them, being lodged on a national tenancy database or whatever action we can actually take. But I think also it's important to point out a couple of things here, Villi, is that some tenants will try us from that point and test to see if what we've said, if we mean what we say. So as soon as that tenant becomes behind for the very, very first time, it's so important that we jump on it really, really quickly. Otherwise, we will lose credibility with them if we're not backing up what we said we're going to do. So
100%.
some of them will test because they are serial late rent offenders, and they're going to try the situation, put their toe in the water. The other point I want to make to people out there is that it's good to know in New Zealand that you can start taking legal action at 4 days behind. For example, however, here in South Australia, we can't lodge the termination of the breach process until the tenant's actually a full 16 days behind before we can then ask for the 2 weeks behind and the 2 weeks ahead if we're doing 2-week repayments. In Western Australia, they can start the process at 1 day behind. So this is, again, if we're in a state where we can't actually start the legal process, say for the first 2 weeks or the first 7 days, even more important is the zero tolerance rent control.
Oh, absolutely. And I think from the legal point of view, that should be the absolute last result. That should be the last thing that you do. So it's what leads up to you taking that legal action that makes it, I guess, a priority. Like for us, day 4, yes, it's a lot sooner than what a lot of people here in New Zealand take action in terms of tenancy tribunal. Like we issue a breach letter on day 2. So our rent arrears policy is zero tolerance, right? So if you've got a zero tolerance rent arrears process, then it should be zero tolerance at day 1, not leaving it until day 7 or day 14 to then actually start to work away on things. To me and to our team, it just seems too long. And so what we want to be able to do is issue, and I'm happy to share, our process, because I think that would probably help people listening. On day 1, it's ascertaining why the tenants are falling behind in rent. It's not a negative. It's just a phone call. So we have automated text messages go out just saying, hey, look, we can just see that you're falling behind in rent. I'm just not sure if there was an issue with your bank or your payments, or can you just get in touch with your property manager as soon as possible so that we can just discuss this and get it sorted. Property manager jumps on that straight away as well. So we've got an SMS automated, and we've got property manager calling on day 1.
So day 1, an SMS goes.
Yep, day 1.
And then if there's no response, or what happens on day 1 as well?
So day 1, our property managers are calling them on day 1 to try and get them to give the property manager a reason why they have missed rent. Now, some things are out of some people's control. Someone's pay didn't go through on that day, and obviously automatic payments were missed. So once we can, ascertain why the rent was missed, then we can work out a plan on how we rectify it. Now, if it comes to day 2 and we still haven't had a response from the tenant, automatic text message go out again, but it's a little bit more in depth this time. It's not so much, hey, we're following up. It's, you're behind in rent 2 days. We haven't heard from you. We need to hear from you in order to get this rectified. A 14-day breach letter is sent, and the property manager is calling again. So there's three points of action. An SMS, a phone call from the property manager, and a 14-day breach letter is emailed and posted.
So this is all within the first 4 days, isn't it?
This is day 2.
Day 2.
So this is day 2. Day 3, So SMS, automatic response again, goes out saying that we still haven't heard from you, still haven't got a plan, we don't know what's going on. You need to contact us ASAP because it's starting to get serious. Property manager calls, and then it's also property manager responsibility to go to the property, knock on the door, and try and sit down with the tenant to get it sorted. If they don't get a response from the tenant being home, a tenant summary of their rent and a letter is put into their letterbox or put into the door jam, and highlighted that they must contact us ASAP.
Wow, that's awesome. I think everyone, again, you might thinking, well, I haven't got time for that. But here's the deal. If you don't give your time proactively, really early in the piece, your time is going to be taken with you reactively putting out fires. So you guys have really taken on this, putting on big boots and stamping out cigarette butts very seriously and putting the energy into that instead of, and killing the issue before it even has a chance to escalate.
Well, I guess if you had a conversation with every property manager out there, Australia and New Zealand, and you said to them, what is, because there's many pain points, right, in property management, there's so many things that can go wrong. But one of the biggest pain points that property managers have is dealing with tenants who fall behind in rent on a consistent basis. So if you don't prioritize that, and if you don't put a process or a plan in place to be able to rectify that, you as a property manager and a property management company are always going to be going through the cycle of no return. You're not going to be able to deliver results. You're not going to be able to have property managers less stressed. So there's a massive cycle around it, how I see it. If you can control it, then it has a really positive flow-on effect for everything else. Property managers feel good when they're on top of things, when they're in control of things. And so therefore, if you've got a property manager who is actioning their rent arrears process a lot sooner than some, they're going to feel in control. They're going to feel good about that. They've got a result. They've had conversation with the tenant. They've got a payment plan in place to be able to rectify that, which means that the property manager can then shift their focus to something else that is more important than dealing with this and investing more time. You know, we talked about the eviction process, starting that process. Their time is far better suited to doing other positive things. So we identified this as, you know, it is a pain point. How do we deal with it? How do we put out that fire, like you said, Darren, a lot sooner than it becoming, you know, huge?
Putting the fire out before it even starts.
Exactly. So for us, it was taking action early. It was going hard early, and trying to get tenants on board with us to be able to get a result, or to get something that is better suited for the tenant, for the owner, and for our property manager as well.
So going in early, going in hard is the key. It really is. It's that, I think, you know, going to, you know, war on the tenant within the first 7 days. But as you guys have even said, that, you know, it's that 1, 2, and 3 days where you're all over it and all the energy goes. So it's not even allowed to go beyond that, which is really good. So this is why you guys have such small amount of tenants behind, and so you would hardly ever probably even get the tribunal for rent arrears or late rent reasons.
Yeah, very, very minimal. And I guess for us here, I'm not sure in Australia, but through our legal system, you know, if we did have a tenant behind in rent, because we've built that rapport right, we go right back from the tenant's induction and the viewing process. We've built that relationship. During the tenancy, for whatever reason, they've fallen behind. So we've collated. The property manager has built a relationship with that tenant, so that the tenant feels like they can't let the property manager down. Now that's really, really important, because I think sometimes we can forget and we can put the tenant to one side, and we shift all our focus to the owner, and we invest all our time and energy into the owner. However, it's just important that you invest time and energy into the tenants as well, because they're the ones that, when times are tough and you're in a situation where they fall behind in rent, you really want them to be able to come to the party and get it sorted. And so what we find is that because of that relationship and that time that we invest with our tenants and building that relationship, we find that when a tenant falls behind in rent, all we have to do is just file for a fast track mediation. And a fast track mediation here in New Zealand is, and I'm not sure, you tell me, Darren, if you have something similar over in Australia, but it's effectively you've already established a payment plan with the tenant. you've had a conversation with the tenant. Hey, look, Mr. Smith, you're falling behind, a week behind in rent. What can you pay that all off in one lump sum next week? If not, can you pay half of it, or $150 over the next 4 weeks? And if you have that agreement with the tenant, because you've built that relationship and the tenant agrees, yep, I'm willing to do that for you, I want to get it sorted as quickly as possible, you fast track the mediation. You get a mediator coming in who pretty much all they're wanting to do is verify the agreement that you've had. And so you've then got a mediated order, a legal order put in place to show the owner that, yes, the tenants have fallen behind in rent, but I've got an order here that stipulates that they are going to pay this on top of their normal weekly rent, another $100 every week for the next 4 weeks to clear it, and then we'll be back on track after that. Yeah. So if I go back to the start, if you didn't have that relationship with the tenant, if you didn't build that rapport, and if you're not clear with your expectations from the induction process, when you try and create a mediated order, you're going to have a dispute. You're not going to have a tenant pick up the phone because they're trying to hide from you. They're trying to steer clear of you. You just can't get that mediated order. And so therefore, it's a longer drawn out process to get a mediation put in place, which potentially goes to tenancy tribunal. So there's a lot more time invested in trying to get the result for yourself and for the owner and for the tenant, where it could have been minimized, right back at the start there. So a huge emphasis for us and our team is making sure we invest the time in being relatable to the tenants, being firm. You have to be, property managers, you have to be firm. You have to be firm. You have to be fair. You have to outline expectations right from the start. Otherwise, tenants will walk all over you. And I think here in New Zealand, obviously there's been a lot of legislation change, and there's huge advocacy groups, which is great. Tenants have a voice, but effectively that creates a little bit more pressure as well, because you have tenants who are disputing, their rights and their obligations, which creates more investment. So if you can really establish a rapport right from the start, you avoid all of that. You avoid disputes, because your tenants want to do everything they can not to disappoint you. And so if you build that goodwill, or brownie points, for whatever reason, then you're going to have, you're setting yourself up for a really positive tenancy throughout. And it makes it so much easier for you as a property manager and property management company, to be able to not have to worry about those tenants, because you know that they're just going to be fine.
No, that's good. I think let's wrap this discussion up, this podcast up. And Villi, I think you've done very well. I know you've been struggling with a flu type thing. We know it's not COVID, but you've been, you struggled there a bit, but you've done really well. Some really good information. But Villi, people want to reach out to you and get in contact. What's the best way to get in contact with you? By email?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And like I say, very open to have a chat with people. I guess, we're all in it together as property managers, no matter if we're here in Australia or New Zealand. And I guess we are, someone called me the other day, you're a special breed, you property managers. And I guess we are, but I think it's important that, with the pain points, the difficulties that we all experience, is that we, come together as a group and share ideas and help each other out, because, it can be quite brutal out there sometimes. It certainly is a stressful industry sometimes. So, happy to help and have a chat to people, who just want a little bit of advice, or, want to pick my brain. I'm always available.
Cool. And Villi's email address is Villi, VILLI at watsonrealestate.co.nz. So .co.nz. Thank you, Villi. Really good discussion. Some really good stuff there. You guys certainly have some of the best, lowest late rent figures I've seen. Really good, and really appreciate your expertise, Villi. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Darren.